My name is Jagdish Upadhyay. Welcome to Balbix Thought Leadership webinar on 5 Ways AI Supercharges CRQ. Today, we'll be cutting through the hype and showing you how AI makes cyber risk quantification real, fast, and actionable. I'm joined by two of my favorite leaders in cybersecurity, Ed Amoroso, CEO of TAG Infosphere, and Gaurav Banga, founder and CEO of Balbix. But before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A option in your Zoom window, and we will take them up towards the end or during the conversation. So let's jump right in. Gaurav, over to you.
All right. Well, first off, thank you, Jagdish. And let me, Ed, always thank you for being here. Welcome. It's always great to talk to you about topics like this. And I know we've been doing this for a very long time. So for those of you who might need, Ed doesn't need any introduction, but I like to call him the second CISO, like the first one being Steve, and who's unfortunately no longer with us. But Ed is the second CISO, like the first lady and the second lady. So he's the second. All right. So Ed has been doing cybersecurity, and he's seen the long and short of it, as I call it, as it has changed the role has changed over the years, and from managing cyber risk at a company as large as AT&T, that cannot be an easy job, as you can imagine. So that's when I first met Ed, when he was at AT&T, maybe 16 years ago or something like that. And we started talking, and we've stayed friends all through this time. And Ed has been very, very instrumental in helping me kind of ground some of the crazy thoughts that I sometimes get around AI and cyber risk. So let me just start off with this, right? So Ed, I think everybody's on the panel has probably used ChatGPT.
Right.
They have probably struggled with ChatGPT at some points of time. And at other times, they've found it extremely useful. So that kind of brings us with the general problem with AI. There's a lot of promise, but there is a lack of precision or a lack of repeatability that comes in different places. And in cybersecurity and other domains, right? Like maybe using AI to help you buy a stock or trade stock, or help use AI to help you with deciding who to hire and who not to hire in your security team, and how to quantify risk. Like how do you, like, as someone who has been at the center of the security industry for a long time and have seen it evolve, how do you parse that question out, right? I mean, what is AI really good for, and what is it not good for? And about cyber risk quantification in general, right? Is it
a good question? I mean, first, thanks to you and Jagdish for including me. I always love talking to you guys because it's sometimes I think I come away, having learned more in these webinars than anybody. I get a lot of, so thank you for including me. This question of when you use AI and when you don't, I think right now we're still very much in a discovery phase in cybersecurity. There's no question. Every day I hear a use case, and in my brain I categorize it as, wow, that's a great application, or that doesn't sound so good, or I don't know. But I'll tell you that when it comes to cyber risk quantification, it's clear there is a nice match here. I think you guys have done a nice job, maybe forging new ground in this area. I was always uncomfortable with making determinations of risk because I'm a mathematician and I understand Bayesian, thinking, and know that the human brain and our human psyche around making determinations of risk, we don't do a very good job. It's the reason why I think people will sleep like a baby in an automobile driving to the airport at 80 miles an hour, where their chances of dying are pretty high. And then they get nervous when they get on an airplane when the airplane is very safe. Humans have this weird sort of way of calculating and measuring risk. Now, maybe we do a little better job in a SOC than, say, the car versus a plane, but there's still that effect. So I've always thought that the mechanization of these metrics that matter are things that first of all should be done by automation. But as I've watched your team and others apply AI to this, it strikes me as a very elegant and very appropriate use of AI. And we can get into some of the less appropriate uses as we talk. But I'd sort of start by saying I know a lot of people came to the webinar or are listening to the recording here on the premise that CRQ, Cyber Risk Quantification, is a fertile ground for using AI. I believe it is, and we can get into that a little bit, but the basic premise here is that I think that you guys have hit on a good place for using neural and deep and machine learning.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I mean, it kind of validates us. From our perspective, if you just look at framing the problem for a second, right? Like you were starting to, right? Which is, first off, human beings either overestimate or underestimate risk based on their biases or what their personal experience in the past might be, or the data that is available to them, right? Which may often not be the complete data, and it's not nobody's fault. It is just who we are, right? So I was just looking at the output of we get like a sample output from every one of our customers, and I picked the top 10 and did an average. So the raw signals that you need to analyze every day is between 75 and 100 million, which includes vulnerabilities, threats, new vulnerabilities, new threats, existing vulnerabilities, existing threats, software metadata, configuration states, the tags, the user roles. They generally come from at least a dozen systems that might include your scanner, your identity system, your EDR, your cloud systems, ServiceNow, and so on and so forth, right? This is one. The amount of data, just the raw data that Balbix processed, compressed data, and uncompressed, it's about 3 to 4 times, 4.5 times that, right? So about 30 gigabytes per day for the average 100,000 asset customer, which is about 30,000 employees, right? And in order to do this, we did, I know people used to talk about gigaflops and megaflops and all that. The total number of floating point operations that needed to get done was about 85 teraflops. That is kind of like mind-boggling, right? It's like that's the inferencing. And then you can actually look at, well, you obviously modeled about 100,000 assets. You tracked about 2 million software instances. The system tracked about 12 million vulnerability instances. It's evaluating based on compliance and everything about 20 million mappings from different standards, your permutations and combinations like CIS for controls and subcontrols. And ultimately, there's about 100 people who are using the system in a typical environment, right? So I was just kind of thinking about if you were to frame the problem as, is there any other way to do this? Right?
I mean, it's even worse than you said, because you've got all the history that needs to be taken into account. So there's an additional dimension. So I don't know that you can do it. I mean, look, you and I are technologists. You can programmatically automate. I mean, I think that the question here for people watching is not so much, should I be automating my metrics? So more around to what degree can I rely on artificial intelligence to do it, either agentically or proactively or reactively, using an LLM? I think the answer is for AI, you definitely can and should. And all of that data actually justifies why you should. When people ask me, like I'm on a big stage or something, and go, hey, a question, hey, should I use AI for this or that? I get that question all the time. You probably do too. And in my mind, the way I'm answering the question is I'm thinking, do you have a lot of data? And if the answer is no, then you don't need AI for that. You don't. You can write a Python program. But if you have the amazing amount of data, then I don't know any other way. And I've been sort of at this for a long time. I mean, you can try, like we've all lived through the era of big data analytics where we were, first found out about Hadoop and things like that. And we tried to get our arms around it. But AI is the perfect app for this because you present your AI with this massive amount of data that you were just describing.
Yeah.
Basically the perfect application for that. So for people listening, when you're trying, you need sort of a personal procedure for when do I use AI, when do I not? Ask the question about data, and it doesn't have to be good data. It can be data that needs to be normalized and curated and streamlined. There's a million things you may want to do to prepare the data, but you are going to need it in volume. And eventually you're going to have to get to decent quality stuff to make good determinations. But that is absolutely true in the enterprise when it comes to cyber risk, because virtually everything contributes to either the probability that something might happen or its consequence. So makes good sense.
That's a great takeaway, which is, should I use AI? Do I have a lot of data? If you don't, then of course.
That's it. It's a pretty simple A or B.
Now let's shift gears over here a little bit and dive a little bit deeper into the topic of cyber risk quantification, right? So this is kind of like, okay, so CRQ, and it's not like we started thinking about CRQ yesterday. We've been thinking about CRQ for a long time, right?
Yeah.
And yet, there is this set of concerns around CRQ that, like, it's not the first time we tried it. So we tried it. It didn't quite work out to be what it was promised to be, right? It was supposed to be the thing that, okay, well, I'll help it, explain things to people who understand money and nothing else, all that, right? So what is
Like
it?
fair model type stuff.
And all that stuff, right? So, one of the key questions that I have for you over here is, Ed, in your view, why is it that people are kind of like, I won't use the word afraid, but sometimes not very excited about CRQ? Like, I mean, what is it that is the obstacle to really using CRQ?
Well, if you do it wrong, you can get in trouble. I'll give you an example. So I'm familiar with, and I won't expose any names or companies here, but familiar with a colleague that I was helping who used a quantification method. It was one of one of those fair model thing where you put a bunch of stuff in and it spits out a bunch of big numbers. Like, whoa, you got all these open TCP ports. You got $1 billion of risk, like something like that, right? So he does that, right? And yeah, the security team gets all excited because you got numbers popping out and they're big. So you can go to senior leadership and say, I need more budget. Look at all this risk I have. The problem was there was whistleblower in there and they sent it off to the US Securities Exchange Commission. They got subpoenas saying, why aren't you reporting all this risk to investors? And it went downhill from there. I was hired to come in and redo the calculation to say, look, open TCP ports is not $1 billion worth of, that's a pretty pedestrian problem. So I think people have been somewhat fearful of these quantifications because they've seen it go wrong. That's where the intelligence comes in. That's where having a good platform. And I don't mean just simple heuristics. I mean having some intelligence around the context and the interpreting the output, making sure it's reasonable, keep you out of trouble. But I love the idea of quantifying, just you want to make sure that it's not, pointing you in the wrong direction. So that would be my estimate as to why people might be a little bit nervous about spitting, some sort of a quantified estimate of what the problems are in your enterprise.
Yeah, one of the challenges that we started thinking about the problem is, one of the challenges that people brought up is that, look, I know how to do a calculation. I know my calculation can be better, but how would I explain it when I'm challenged? If you can help me with that and help me win that kind of an argument, then that's key for me, right? And that unfortunately is not easy, right? I mean, you're standing in front of a bunch of CFO types who are typically your board members, and they ask you, well, where did you come up with that $1 billion number or $40 million number? and now you have to defend it in a very simple way. Right? And then a lot of cybersecurity is non-intuitive, but sometimes the defense might be, well, so and so other company got into a similar situation and they were fined 42 million. That's the only explanation that the board members will take. And any other kind of technical explanation, you'll kind of lose them. So getting that formula right, which is, how do you explain it to a different audience? And that's where Gen AI also comes in. Like it kind of knows, hey, who do you want to explain this number to? Right. And I can
Agree.
try. It's not like trickery or anything. It's just like converting a machine technical conversation into, what might be more appreciated by a particular type of audience, right? And that's kind of key, because if you don't have that, you're talking technical CV mumbo jumbo to a bunch of board members, they're not going to get it, right? So,
I
but they're going
think
to hire.
it tends to be easier to do the consequence analysis because you make a list of all the bad things that can happen. I'm going to get in my car, I could crash, I could go over the guardrail, I could do this, I could do that. But when it comes time to calculating the probabilities, it's harder. And that's where the attack surface management comes in. You guys are good at that. In fact, you helped invent a lot of those things. That's where context and really understanding what playing field is pretty important. So again, making a list of bad things that can happen is the way we all did it 20 years ago. You'd march into the boardroom and they'd say, well, what happens if I don't run antivirus on all these computers? Well, we could have malware that comes in and like you'd go through these scenarios, just flinging out these claims that this can happen and this can happen, and rarely challenged as to whether or not that's really possible or likely or very likely, what it would be. So that again, once we bring all those dimensions together, the consequence probability, and then all of the attack surface context, the specifics around the enterprise, you put that together, human beings not going to be able to process that. It's perfect opportunity for automation. And because there's so much data, I think AI immediately. And that's what you guys do. Again, I've always been very impressed. You always seem like you're about 2 weeks ahead of everybody else. I don't know how you do it, but you always have a pretty good sense of where
We
things are going.
listen to people's problems a little bit.
I shouldn't say two, maybe it's more like 2 years, but so you've done a good job, sensing what can and should be done. Because you and I both know that anybody listening has probably been subjected to a dozen AI pitches in the last couple of weeks. And if you were at the RSA conference recently, then you were accosted every other booth with, hey, I'm using AI to do this, I'm using AI to do that. And that's where it does require some maturity and some judgment as to whether or not the application is appropriate. Sometimes it's not.
So I think there is two parts to this, right? What you said, there is the impact side or scenario modeling, which is relatively straightforward, where you kind of look up the loss data and say, okay, well, that's one of the scenarios I need to model from. And then on the other side of the risk equation, the risk quantification equation, there's the likelihood part, which relies on a good understanding of your attack surface and keeping up with, what parts of the attack surface are higher probability and which one of these are kind of like less. And I thought like it might be instructive to really talk about some of the challenges that we have to do, and I'm just going to throw it up so that people can get a better sense of how AI can help over here. So I've just thrown this thing up over here so that everybody can kind of see and understand, kind of like some of the challenges that have to be solved on the likelihood side. For example, you have to calculate the blast radius or do the risk propagation modeling or figuring out software and asset to known catalogs and then map them to CPEs and then map those to TTPs, going to CVEs, or to kind of do analytics on these, which can be pretty large amounts of data. And these are all the AI techniques, if you will, that that kind of like there are some words at the bottom of each one of these blocks that kind of explain how these models work. And if you were to just think about something like this and try to see the alternative, right, which is if you want to get an accurate calculation of likelihood, then how else would we do it, right? But this is interesting. It's technical. This is the problem that we have solved over the last 9 years that our company has been in existence. And I kind of look at the entire industry has supported us to come up with these models over here. But I think one of the most important topics around CRQ is, okay, I got a number. It's not good. So what? Now what? Right? So I think the biggest value of CRQ is, the biggest question is, how do you make it actionable? Like, what do you do with it?
Right. Well, you got to understand context, right? I mean, if you don't have a reasonable understanding of your attack surface and of your assets, then anything you're going to be recommending is going to look like it was generated by some dopey chat GPT, like real generic and non-applicable. That's what, when everybody says something's actionable, here's what goes in my mind. Because you and I can get some LLM and say, hey, give me an action plan for blah, 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 it'll do it. But it doesn't know my context. No, it's just going to make some generic thing up. Actionable means you understand my circumstance. You understand what I can and can't do. You understand what my boss is comfortable with. You understand that maybe we did that already and it didn't work. So please don't recommend something I already tried and didn't work. Or that my boss said, we're not doing that. And then you tell me to do that. That's not actionable. You don't know my context. So that's the problem. It's one of the problems that I have with these public LLMs being used for business decisions. It's sort of like, when you listen to these radio call-in programs and somebody says they spend 30 seconds telling them about their life and then the person tells them their whole answer. And you think, you don't know that person. There's so much more dimension to this. And you've solved their problem in 30 seconds. LLMs do that now. Generative AI is happy to recommend whatever. And I think that that's not actionable. I think it's a data point, but you need to be tangled in. Like in the context of your platform, you guys are pulling data. So the data drives the context. You're not doing this in general. You're doing it for your customer. So it's like, so that's it. The answer is, if you want it to be actionable, you better be pulling contextual data. Otherwise, what's the difference? I could just spin some roulette wheel and come up with an answer.
So that's really, I think, technically, that is a very simple word, as you call it. You have to ground the algorithms in actual context and facts. And that grounding is probably the single most important thing that you can do, because that kind of unlocks the actionability and then kind of makes things, okay, do X, Y, and Z. And then when you say, well, I can't do X because my boss doesn't like it, and I don't have the money, that kind of money, what is the best I can do?
Money, right? That's a big one.
And then you come back with, okay, here's the best you can do, and this is the amount of residual risk that you're left with, which is outside your acceptable level, right? And here's the calculation for that. That is the kind of conversation you want to be able to have with your system, which is grounded on your context. Now, I don't think we have a lot of time left, but there's 3 topics that I think rapid fire questions for you, and maybe you have some insight. These are really, I'm going to go back to your, not your your current role, but your previous roles. Like, first off, when you have something as illuminating as data-driven X, right? One of the things that people are sometimes afraid about is that they're finally accountable. Like, what if I show a number and then now I own the number, right? Before that, it was a whole bunch of technical details, and I really wasn't accountable, because I could always say, hey, the adversary is doing this, this, and this. But what if I show a number and then I show an action plan? now I am accountable for it. And that can scare off some people because cyber is such a hard problem, understandably so. Right? A lot of
Right.
things outside your control. How do you think about that, Ed?
Well, it all depends, right? This idea of having action plans and numbers is is going to be different depending on the circumstance. If you're a brand new CISO and you're taking over a program, and I installed a Balbix platform and I start getting some quantifications of things. To be honest with you, what I'm kind of hoping for, and don't tell anybody I said this is just between us friends, you're kind of hoping that the numbers are bad. You are. I mean, you want the baseline to be, hey, look, my lab, I'm taking over a mess here, and that's good. It's tougher if everything's great, then you've got a little bit more challenge. But let's say you've been in the job for 5 years and you've been running a program, and I'm running your platform. I better be showing progress. And that's the problem, because the data is what it is. And it's the great truth serum, right? The AI is not going to go, hey, it's really this, but I know you need a better number, so I'll give you something better. It's not going to do that. So look, this is time to put on the big boy pants. This is time, or big girl pants. This is grown up stuff. So when you start getting quantification, it's going to expose whether you've done a great job or a bad job. And again, whether that's going to be something you welcome will be dictated by where you are in your career, what it is that you're trying to accomplish, where you are in this journey as you're, say, running an enterprise or part of an enterprise security program. The way you interpret the numbers will be different.
And I guess that's a great advice. Second question, rapid fire again, right? Which is, I'm not mature enough to start a CRQ project. I'll do it. It's kind of like, when I hear that question, it's baffling to me because I kind of like go back to just saying, if I can't measure it, how am I going to improve it? I could get lost in I could spend $1 million that would be on the wrong things, right? So I mean, I understand you may not want to quantify risk, but you definitely have to get a good handle on this automation of likelihood at least, right? Which is like, I'm making all these investments. So what is your advice to someone who's thinking like this? Like, I'm not mature enough to start measuring my attack surface. I'm not mature enough to start measuring my risk. I'm not mature enough to start a CRQ project.
I mean, I'd say, well, then who is mature enough? Is it like government, like the US State Department? Are they mature enough? They get hacked all the time. Is it a big bank? I mean, most banks have had terrible incidents. Nobody thinks their program is perfect, and everybody is at some point in the journey. I mean, how do you think you get to maturity? You get to maturity by acting like one, and quantifying your risk and having some sort of contextual understanding of your surface. That's how you get there. So I mean, maybe the right answer is, if I think I'm not mature, I shouldn't do it. Then you'd say, well, you're interpreting that wrong. If you think you're not mature, let's get you mature, and here's how you start. But again, I would say that even the bigger companies that have big budgets and so on, maturity is a funny thing, right? I mean, you could have a little SMB that has an amazingly mature program, and a big giant, you and I have both seen big giant companies that are a complete mess, right? So I don't think there's necessarily a correlation between being small and maybe not as well funded and being mature. I don't think the two are related.
And the last question, and I know we're going to get out of time in just a minute. I do want to measure. I do want to do CRQ. I want to measure my attack surface, but I have no budget. So
Yeah.
what is your advice for someone in that kind of like situation? Now they have to go and convince their boss for more money, ask for more money. How would you go about doing that?
You have to rationalize and consolidate. That's where we are now in our industry. We're at the point now where CISOs have to learn some CIO economics. And that means it's not reasonable in 2026 and beyond to have a lot of fluff in your program. Not everybody does, but some do. And I think the rationalization, the avoidance of duplication, the avoidance of paying for things you're not using, the avoidance of selecting a vendor that offers way more than you need. You only need a Hyundai and you bought a Ferrari. These are things that CISOs will need to learn in the next few years. CIOs learned how to do this years ago. Now we need to learn how to do it. And I think that's the way you answer the question of what do I do if I don't have budget? The answer is get budget.
Well, Ed, thank you for all the advice. This is so much fun. Again, thank you all for joining us. And I think we'll have a recording of this available. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can send them to us, or we can route them to Ed and get you some answers. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.